Alrighty. Canto 9 is finished. It's not perfect, not the most polished and complete Canto we've ever gotten, but it's still rather solid, I reckon. I'm not going to try to do a beat-by-beat breakdown of every node from start to finish, but I'll try my best to cover the highlights and the more sore spots. Plus, I recommend playing through yourself, or watching first before getting into this video. There will 100% be things that I miss, and or decide not to cover, since if I was going to do every last portion of this, we'd be stuck here for 8 or more hours instead. That said, I've done 2 videos on part 1 and 2 already, so I'll be brief with those before diving into the meatiness of part 3. Let's be quick about it then. The good of part 1. Part 1 acts as the foundation for the following 2 parts. There's an immediate sense of unease and dread out of the gate, as the narrative comes to us for once, and we're tossed into a desperate emergency situation. The overlay of doubt and the feeling that there is something eerily wrong about almost every interaction clouds over each scene. We later only get substantive proof in Otis's Uptie story, Team Leader 1's demise, and the final forced conversation at the end. The feeling that we've been set up or are being led into a trap is prevalent throughout. The story, art, music, and overall presentation of the assaulted LCE facility is conveyed rather well, especially in the off-key notes, color palette, and claustrophobic encounters. To add to this, the new and returning characters breathe a lot of life and color into each interaction, wherein we dig into Roshu's past further as well as get a glimpse into how Limbus Company functions in the other departments. Notably, we have Valencina and Lucio, who are very physical in their abuse and guidance. Valencina is shown to have a history of physical abuse with Roshu, whereas the textbook is a target of the ongoing abuse, perhaps mirroring what Roshu would have been going through if she had decided to stay in the House of Spiders. This will be the case for quite a lot of the apprentices to follow as well. Regardless, we get a lot of hype for them, cool boss theme, solid fights, and of course, Virgilius' entrance that subsequently allows us to venture to the LCE. Regarding the LCE, we get a glimpse into the day-to-day operations alongside the precautions and procedures they would normally follow. Well, there was supposed to be an emergency alarm, according to Alyssa, but no such thing happened. Plus, the entire department was caught off guard. A good chunk of them were impaled by spirals and left to their own devices. Adding on to that, many of the abnormalities in the facility have been released from their containment. We fight through a bunch of enhanced and reworked railway editions of the Abnos, specifically the Fey Lantern, Wayward Passenger, and Ebony Queen's Apple. Each of their reworks make them significantly harder fights than previously, and will be added later as our new Fred Luxcavations. Eventually, we make it to the broadcast room. Initially, we are threatened by explosive devices that would have been illegal to have in the city, but in the survivors' heads, they're trying their best to threaten away any would-be assailants, even if the room is quite full of intelligent personnel. We're given a chance to catch up with the rest of the LCE staffers, as well as a proper introduction to Moses and Ezra of the LCD. Having all of these high-end figures in one facility all at once for a demonstration, the sapling grafting seems to be on purpose. It also adds to the feeling of unease, since having all of them here would make for the perfect time for an external force to eliminate them all at once. Regardless, the party is split into teams to address various objectives around the facility. Retrieval of golden bows, power restoration, etc. Unfortunately, they're befooled by a sudden split, wherein the facility comes to life for a brief moment, locking down and splitting the party. We get a few more tidbits of Roshu's past, especially when we're met face to face with the Index Nurse Father Reen. He seems like a rather nice fellow, at least for now. Well, aside from the fact that he's mincing the LCA to pieces in front of us. Nonetheless, the split parties arrive at their objectives and get to working on them. We're mostly narrowed in on Dante's perspective with Roshu, Masalt, Yisung, and Gregor. Though they're a somewhat awkward bunch, they do their best to stay optimistic while securing the golden bows. They speak of Roshu's smoking habits as we get a hang on what we're dealing with here. There's a few flashbacks already, though they mostly regard Rien and Shiomi. Finally, as we battle through more and more mannequins, we come face to face with the Pinky Nurse Father and 2 apprentices in the Golden Bows containment chamber. Here we get our first real boss fight. Ren of the Pinky and Albino of the Ring. They make for a rather unique Part 1 ending, as both their kits have some funky gimmicks to play around. While not a hard fight, if this is the quality of fight we can expect going forwards, that would be appreciated. We're given a scripted ending this time, before the golden bows are stolen from us by the Pinky Nurse Father, thus ending Part 1. The bad part of part 1. Now for the not so good parts. First off, the naming of the nodes is a bit of a mess. They're either a little nonsensical or have little to do with what they're actually referencing. The spider's thread in this case was probably the worst literary reference they could have made here, especially knowing how they plan to use the short story later on. Abikyokan is very on the nose, since it is Pandemonium, a layer of Buddhist hell. That said, it is indeed hell because they're just two back-to-back filler Pekatula fights. You cannot convince me that they're there to let you have some downtime to process your thoughts. These fights are just garbage, and having two of them back-to-back is a pretty big slap in the face to this part's pacing. The only thing that makes that even worse is the triple Abno gauntlet. On your first time through, they all take quite a while since you don't know what's changed or why they're suddenly beating your ass in. Some fellas especially had trouble with the Ebony Apple, but I would like to point to the Fey Lantern and Wayward Passenger both instead. Those two are rather stally fights, since the Fey Lantern likes sinking under for a pseudo-invulnerability phase, whereas the Wayward Passenger takes their portals instead. On repeats for dailies, they're quite easy once you know their gimmicks, but the first time through, these three are bullies for the average player. Even worse if you're a win rate spammer. Anyhow, if you don't mind me addressing the elephant in the room in regards to the most spammed encounter throughout this canto, we've got the mannequins. There's no real good way of fighting through them, and due to mostly being in unfocused battles, playing around their passives and skills can get annoying if you wish to go fast. Bringing any kind of attack weight with you is asking for unbreakable coin hell, whereas if you accidentally clash into their guard, you are 100% asking to get staggered in the following turn. That said, if you are particularly careful about how you kill them, they shouldn't provide too much trouble, just costing more time to actually get through, since you'll need to use a lot more defensive skills yourself to offset theirs. Regardless, they're a stall-heavy opponent which doesn't like you dealing damage to them at all, at risk of getting slapped back hard. This means no matter how you go about taking them on, it'll usually take around 6 or more turns. To add fuel to the fire, they have an alternative type, which is them with pink ribbons. Literally a Mon-Hun subspecies at that point, only worse, and speed isn't really all that detrimental to lose in an unfocused encounter. The potential SP damage from Urge can be, but is otherwise inconsequential, meaning this variant on the mannequins is almost meaningless, at least in unfocused encounter. Alright, they also unstagger themselves. Fantastic, isn't it? Now, as for why they're so annoying beyond that, they're used in 8 nodes total throughout the canto. Almost 20% is fighting mannequins. While 2 of those fights are in focused settings and are used there appropriately, the rest are almost all exclusively filler fights with little rhyme or reason beyond oh whoops, more mannequins. Not to mention we have to see them a couple of days a week for EXP Luxcavation, which is painful. That said, 5 instances of mannequins are in part 1 alone. In the 11 fights here, almost half of them are against these fuckers. I know a bunch of you claimed they were forgivable since they made unfocused encounters more interesting, but the lack of variety here stings a lot. We don't really learn till later of the Nurse Fathers being ostracized from their various fingers either. There was the impression that we'd be fighting a couple of finger goons, at least to spice things up, but alas, that was not the case for narrative reasons. Well, at least we get the middle and thumb for our Luxes. Last, of course, is the Sinner Split. While it makes sense for narrative purposes, not being able to play the other perspectives for now, or even us being locked to the same 4 sinners for repetitive fights to come, is rather ass. There's no good solution here until we hit part 3, but even then that doesn't excuse what's to come in part 2 as well. Outside of gameplay elements, the lack of visible Charon is still a mess and a half. While we get the funny passive icon on our sinners, we don't really get the feeling that Lucio is fighting with Charon in his arms or care at all. Instead, he really is going all out on his moveset, which just makes it seem all the more stranger. This goes double when he supposedly tosses Charon to Valencina before their clash against one another. He is completely unhampered in the cutscene. As for Virgilius being fought to a standstill by Valencina, for the time being, and relevant time gap before the two's arrival, that's still a point of contention and a mess of sorts. That said, knowing her kit now and the essence of the fighting style she uses, the longer the fight goes on, the more she's able to suppress Virgilius with her speed, not allowing him to access ego and sweep the fight quite as easily. Plus, in retrospect, this scene gets a few more flowers, but you can still make the meme that Virgilius is a paid actor here, I won't lie. Aside from that, I'm not a big fan of Moses' psychoanalysis still. I've read Distortion Detective at this point, and while there's clearly a method to the madness and her powers, filling out Roshu's insides in front of everyone was still a dick move. Sure, we've done that with Dante with literally everyone else's fathoms, but Moses is mostly an outsider here still. we've only had a Zoom call with her. While I can more so forgive it now, it still doesn't read very elegantly, even if she's trying to be the smartest person in the room in a room full of smartasses. There's also Vesper's mention. In hindsight, the idea that they were keeping him in the wings in case anyone in the room was a traitor is smart. But I wish we had at least 1 or 2 more lines to cover their asses rather than just saying it's a secret. If they wanted the deception to be a little stronger, they could have just said he was assigned elsewhere for the time being, or something along those lines. That way, when he arrives, it calls back a little nicer. Anyhow, that about wraps up part 1, leading us to part 2. The good of part 2. While I've definitely torn into this part hard before, there's still some good stuff here. It's not all doom and gloom, or hype moments and aura storytelling. Though my initial reaction wasn't the greatest, admittedly, if you go back through the VOD, part 1 didn't inspire too much confidence with how they decided to utilize the repetitive mannequin fights and Abno gauntlets. I was going in with a shitty mindset. Anyhow, part 2 is where we get more of the apprentices, at least the most development for a single apprentice. The other 4 are hand-waved quite hard here, and we only really get stuff for Sora. That of which is introduced to us shortly. After learning that the apprentices are there to return Roshu to the fold and resume her training, potentially as new fetters, we run right into Sora and Raki. These two have been keeping each other company for a bit in a kinda cute way, speaking to one another while crushed under rubble. They join us for a bit under the guise of being rookie LCE members. Anyhow, past there, we get Heathcliff sliding technology. Won't lie, it reminds me of a lot of old visual novels in regards to how they make action happen on screen. Further than that though, we get characterization in the form of Heathcliff's wits saving the party from imminent danger. There's also Don trying to release Sancho if it means saving all of them, but being denied due to the great risks. Both of these showcase the importance of their found family to one another, which goes a long way in showing their developments. We get a proper look at the ring nurse father to boot, rather than the hideous statue he had left earlier. Man is damn obsessed with corpus works, which is very unmonetizable, but I'm surprised they've been getting through the filter. Aside from that, we get Kira being rather carefree in her approach to hunting down the other sinners. In retrospect, man, they really didn't need to be that scared of her. But yeah, just dog on the kid. No, seriously, the team would have been fine, even with just Ezra. Next of note is the appearance of the contract in Roshu's memories. They get forced saying the funny company slogan or whatever it's supposed to be. Price that way is a lot heavier because of part 3 later. Nonetheless, another sinner shown on the screen accepting contract terms. Trying to recall which others we've had in the past. Whether it was just Yi-sung and Virgilius, or if there were more than those two. Don perhaps, but that was more so at the behest of Virgilius rather than Faust. Anyhow, I digress. We do a few scarier Abno fights, notably the absolute bastard that is the Ardor Blossom Star Moth. Since most people have been running Tremor into that thing, their damage is getting gutted thanks to Tangle Cleaver being Wrath and the other IDs in that archetype having Wrath to deal with. Fluff does okay though. Nonetheless, just rip off the wings and it goes down. Fail to do so in time and it'll be a pretty harsh reset. Eventually we get to the inevitable Sora betrayal. Despite the Sinner's best efforts to keep them away from Dante, they inflict a pretty bad wound on them. Oh, and Dome Raki in one hit. Bella did not stand a chance. Plus, before the Pinky Nurse Father, we take on Sora. The fight is quite fun. Pre-script shenanigans unlock Shin and Mang, and of course, Effloresced Ego. All of these combined make it so we don't really stand much of a chance against her with so few sinners. Although the irony is that Laysalt can keep up to an extent thanks to being a Shin user too. Couple that with regrets and the fella can surprisingly contribute to the fights even on the back foot. After a while, Vesper arrives. While it is a bit of a whim for them to help us out, we get a fancy cutscene and plenty of high quality fan service. There's also some lore and skill descriptions, but we'll get to all of those later, as the fella's not the only one with them by a long shot. His is just the more prevalent example during these 2 parts. Anyhow, the fight is pretty much an extended cutscene from here, until we down Sora and part ways. We get some background on how much of a freak Mussault really is before staring down the Pinky Nurse Father. They don't engage us until we engage them. In hindsight, there's more to it than not seeing us as a threat, but we'll get back to that later. For now though, Dante sees that we're in trouble, and in times of trouble, surely they can awaken a new Durante ability. However, they reach too deep, or rather for the wrong one, and cause everything to go horribly wrong for a moment. We get one hell of an out-of-body experience that makes reference to more affairs beyond our comprehension. The Final Kingdom, the 32 Paths, and 13 Sinners. From Furies floating around, this is most likely in reference to the Kabbalah, in where the 10 Sephiroth are paved between by 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, those of which can either be combined with the Thoth Tarot or more arcane concepts. The usual breakdown is 3 mothers and elements, 7 singles in planets, days, or senses, and finally 12 doubles in the form of constellations, months, or organs. There's a lot to unpack there, but it does indeed show off what the future may hold. There's a lot more esoterica beyond there, but bloody hell, I'm not diving into that hellhole now. We can talk about divination and other madhouse concepts used in this franchise another time. I don't know, look at this ridiculous chart and tell me if you can fully grasp and make sense of it. I'd need to lie down for a month or two after going through it. Regardless, this moment has the most consequences of any node in Part 2, since following it, we go straight to the other perspectives, wherein things are going poorly. Matthias crashes into the LCD crew and crushes most of their attempts to thwart him. Engdu loses both her arms in the process, where most of the others are bloodied. It's only by the grace of Vesper's arrival that they manage to hang on and survive. That said, there's something of a meta joke here with Kira and the Gossipium. Unfortunately, I've seen art that I will not divulge of that floating around at this point, though some fellas have gotten real creative to say the least. Regardless, we can cut over to Hohenheim's team, who are barely able to begin repairs on the generator. It's a ramshackle job that only Hohenheim knows his way around, and thus when Dante's stunt gets pulled off and all the sinners drop to the ground, Hohenheim and Martin are left defenseless. We get a cry of genuine emotion from Faust as she goes down, concerned for Hohenheim's safety. The 2 leftover LCE researchers are then forced to make a fatal decision over which of them lives. But as they try to convince one another who should die more, Martin ultimately wins out and sacrifices himself in using his ego gear to lure the ring nurse father away. Hohenheim gives the nurse father some choice words, but ultimately has no choice but to acknowledge his colleague's sacrifice. We eventually get some further payoff for this later, even, so keep a pin in there. Finally, we get the matchup against the Pinky Nurse Father proper. It's a rather straightforward fight that's surprisingly win-rateable. While it's somewhat reminiscent of a fight against the Blue Reverberation thanks to the blade trails, there's the feeling that something is missing still. Nonetheless, we get cutscened to a defeat before Part 2 begins concluding. Note, the Pinky Nurse Father all but spits at us and can actually speak, despite supposedly missing their tongue. They leave with the golden bows in hand. Rian stops by next to pick up Sora and leave behind a vault. The same such vault that Roshu had left her daughter in. Despite desperately cracking it open, she finds it empty, collapsing on the spot. The pure desperation and the scarred in combination to her arms speaks volumes about how much the kid meant to her. Nonetheless, it is empty, with a few scratches and hitches on the interior here and there. Past all of that is the preparations for the assault upon the House of Spiders. We have the LCA, the LCB, LCD, and LCE all armed and dangerous. Hohenheim gets a glow up too, since having lost Martin to the ring nurse father makes this personal. Heck, he's even shaved and taken off his glasses. Regardless, we leave off resolved to storm the House of Spiders. The bad of Part 2. Oh boy, I've got a few unpopular opinions here. Rather, anyone who read Distortion Detective really hates my takes with a burning passion. Anyhow, first to figure is the roughness of the continuity. With 3 different perspectives, it's mildly difficult to fully keep up with everyone or otherwise account for time. More so, very little space is granted to each perspective. While this could be fixed by giving us a proper perspective character per different group, say Moses for the LCD and Hohenheim for the LCE, this part is far too compact to make it matter quite as much. Too much time is spent on the main group with Dante, with a lot of trash and filler fights. We get more Pecatula, we get more mannequins, and we also get 2 more Abnos that will get added to our dailies. Which is rather unfortunate because we are fighting them while the party is split to boot, meaning for a vast majority of Part 2, we're only using 4 sinners. This includes the Sora fight too, which means for 2 whole parts, we can't even use any of the new IDs that have been released in much meaningful content. Heck, it's been like that for Part 1 also, since the split carries over. Regardless, most of my qualms originally were held with the handling of Vesper and the LCD. Though Vesper has some small bit of setup before he arrives, warding off the Deus Ex allegations, I personally would have rather he'd done the opposite, wherein he saves the LCD first, but is then told to run over and help out the LCB once things were handled. Instead, he chance stumbles upon us first, destroys Sora, Aura farms, and leaves, storming at Mach speed over to Moses in just the nick of time to fend off Matthias. While I get the dramatic pacing and the cool factor of arriving when he's needed, the original setup is just too convenient. Though speaking of Node 9-31, I had one hell of a crash out recorded for that. While it's not nearly quite as bad after reading Distortion Detective, after reading Part 3, Matthias' insecurities probably should have been more centered around the things he had to do for that sword. It would have clued us in better for the things he had gone through and hinted to us that the Nurse Fathers aren't there by choice necessarily, but instead out of disgrace. Instead, the whole thing with Plamo is now even more retroactively shallow and adds little to the plot in the long run. On repeat watch, it only takes me more out of the experience, especially with the more meta dialogue here. Now Kira, on the other hand, I can forgive more, due to how we see her act for the most part later. But nonetheless, this one needed more time to bake, or better still, a perspective centered on Moses. Listening to Moses' reasoning, their way of handling distortions or weaponizing their opponent's insecurities would have gone a long way in building up to the LCD's all-out attack. Instead, looking from the outside is rather wild, since after having read Distortion Detective, there's a lot of reasoning involved there. Why they decided to switch it up for a more confusing execution is beyond me, but this could have been handled better if they were willing to give us more than an omniscient narrator for each scene. While the same can't necessarily be said about the LCE crew, I do believe they would benefit from seeing Hohenheim's thought process, though the subtlety of Martin and Hohenheim's exchange is still the most brilliant part there. As for potential additions to have made this part more engaging, give us a funny cutscene fight where the sinners try to fend off the Ring Nurse Father in their default identities. We got one for Camille and Don. I don't see why we can't get overwhelming odds thrown at us and get even more riled up when we can finally face him down and pay it all back. That would have been loads more fun than having an updated abnormality or filler fight. If the pieces were in play already for Part 3, I reckon repurposing them here would have been an amazing use of time. Heck, put a turn limit on the fight, wherein by hitting the limit, Dante forcibly drags them away, ending the fight. The ways they could have gone for more ludonarrative harmony here were plenty, but instead we got the rushed cut. Aside from that, the title of the nodes are only worse this time. Children 1, Children 2, Shock Centipede 1, Shock Centipede 2. You get the idea. Part 2 needed a lot more time to bake, but if all the resources were devoted to Part 3, that would be understandable considering what we got. I just wish we got a more consistent product out of this Canto, instead of needing the third part to retroactively fix the rest, or otherwise endear the players to the jank of what we had already gotten. At that point, you may as well not play until all 3 parts are out, but that's just sad, you know? The best part of the 3-act structure is wasted here. Instead, feeling like this was more so structured around a 2-act affair. At that point though, you may as well turn parts 1 and 2 into a Madhouse Intervallo, and extend part 3 into a full-on Canto to cover that one's flaws too, that of which we'll get to real soon. Regardless, time for the new stuff. The good of Part 3. Part 3 is a bit of a mess. In brief, I can say that it combines exceedingly high production with an emotional gut punch, as well as a potent story regarding bonds and ties that bind. First off, we're starting in media res. We're straight into the action with Sinclair as we raid the House of Spiders. Right away, we square off against Albina before Callisto joins. Even better still, we have Hohenheim and Alyssa alongside for the ride, a supplement for the team split. Dante can now control sinners across multiple groups and coordinate them independently. To accommodate for the lack of clock winding, each party also has emergency K-Corp ampules in case anyone is suffering from fatal wounds. This kind of setup is exceedingly thoughtful and accounts for the NPC's inability to return to life, as well as showing off the stupid amount of budget Limbus Company has fulfilled for such a raid of this scale. Every group has the ampules and can make quick use of them to boot. Anyhow, the ring fight is pretty fun. It doesn't feel the most scripted compared to a lot of other fights in this part. It genuinely feels like you could lose, since you don't have a colored fixer or powerhouse of any kind with you. Just Sinclair, Bost, Ishmael, and the LCE remnants. Hohenheim has a bunch of cool gear, as does Alyssa, even if we know how she inevitably plans to use it. Regardless, the fight starts simple with Albina alone before bringing in Callisto to turn the fight into a dance between master and apprentice. They have skills that synergize with one another and look out for each other. Since our compatriots are more on the mortal end of things, their contribution is potentially rather light, although important for specific mechanics. While this fight can go quite long if you're careful, I've seen people more recklessly target it with clears as low as 6 turns from what I've seen in the clear statistics. Nonetheless, this one is what I consider a real fight. There's not as much fanfare compared to the others, but it does feel like you're playing the game for this one. In the end, all the participants but Alyssa are pinned on stakes, causing her to ABS max attunement and explode. She doesn't die instantly like Force does, but is severely wounded in order to save everyone else. This fight is thankfully also the last time we're going to be seeing the mannequins, though there isn't a single fodder or trash fight left now. It's, as I predicted, a full-on boss rush until the end. Next, we're squaring up against the middle. While I reckon this is the weakest of the perspectives, it does clue us in finally on how Roshu was treated by Matthias. Essentially, he was the Disneyland dad that was throwing anything and everything at her if it meant her comfort. Though he's quite extreme in his affections, having no holds barred at all when it comes to Roshu. Giving her the easy road isn't doing all too much for her, but it's a cruel kindness in removing the value of things given to her. After all, if she could have anything she wanted at the snap of her fingertips, there wouldn't be much meaning in owning anything, would there? Further contributing to hollowing her out. In that regard, did you know that apparently over 83% of people that win the lottery suffer depression later in life? Winning that much money devoids you of purpose outside of endless consumerism. You can draw the parallels from there. You also get more on how Kira acts as an apprentice. He follows the rule of cool, but otherwise doesn't care for code. If she can steal a cool move from a fixer, she will, but unlike Don, doesn't embody their ideals, merely their style. She's a rather sad hollow shell when you think about it too hard, and with the rest that was outlined above, I reckon that sounds about right. As for the fight itself, it's a lot of LCD fan service. Like, a lot. If you thought Vesper fighting Sora was too much, then you're about to get an overdose on LCD fan service. We get sprites for Ezra and Moses, which both join in on the fight. Ultimately though, it's a watch Vesper win the fight for you. Flash out Kira, let the LCD do the heavy lifting to take out the former great brother. Moses does some support work and Ezra loses almost every clash she's a part of in stunning fashion. When the fight hits a certain HP gate, it's over, moving us along to the next. Oh, of course, we have Don, Jisung and Honglu here, though they ultimately end up having the least fun things to do. We next pop past Rian and his empty words. He just lets us go by, surprisingly, leading us to confronting the Pinky Nurse Father, who should have Arya. Kiyomi's relationship with Roshu is by far the most complicated. Don't become me stings a lot, when it's all that the House of Spiders is really doing. They become exceedingly alike as biological mother and daughter, down to their appearance and eventually their eyes once augmented. It's a cruel fate for both of them, as Shiomi's resentment towards her grows as Roshu becomes more and more like her. She's shriveling and getting old, while her daughter slowly replaces her. She's shackled to her fate nonetheless, as that is the Nurse Father's duty. It reminds me a little more of the Picture of Dorian Gray than an Akutagawa work, which is particularly strange, but that is way too weird a work to compare this to at all. From there, we get the introduction of Arya proper, and the kind of fetter she would become for Roshu within the House of Spiders. Regardless of past reminiscing though, we are in for a fight. This one is an endurance fight. I would consider this a real fight compared to an extended cutscene like the previous one. The only caveat this time is that you really should pack a source of healing, whether it be pursuance or cassetti salts. Either is more than enough to get through. However, without it, it can get pretty rough as you get to the third or fourth phase of the fights. Rushing her down in terms of damage is rather tough, but as is out-sustaining her regenerating shield and fixed damage. As long as you play to her gimmick, she's not particularly hard to clash out, and you do also have access to healing ampules. It's just over time, the damage she deals does rack up quite a lot. Overall, it's a very strategic fight, but you need to think more long-term to get past it. Very fun to work around and play through when you know what you're doing. Frustrating as hell if you're expecting a cutscene ender to trigger far earlier in her HP bar. Anyhow, next we're off to the Thumb and our last group with Rodya, Gregor and Heathcliff. This one gets some of the more dramatic as hell moments later on. We're already familiar with how Lucio fights. As for Valencina, well, she's busy with the renegades for now. We can burst down Lucio exceedingly fast here before the other two join the fights. Once they do though, Valencina is easily one of the most threatening of the Nurse Fathers. Not only because she hunts down and singles out individual sinners to kill them dead, but because she has a stupid high evade that makes her virtually untouchable. It's a 28 roller later on, making it impossible to hit her. She even counters back if all the coins are evaded. With how high the defense level is to boots, we are not getting anywhere near hitting her. Thankfully though, we have Virgilius here, and while he doesn't make short work of her necessarily, he does make this fight less painful. Anyhow, after enough damage has been done, with the Nurse Father on death's door, Lucio makes a last-ditch effort to at least take Gregor with him. He's almost successful even, until Valentina screams out at Lucio to finish the job. Her words, a bit unfortunate in triggering Gregor's PTSD. Instead, Lucio suffers one of the worst possible deaths an apprentice can face here, getting his heart torn clean out by Gregor's bug arm in an awakened form. Deriving from Lucio as he breathes his last is quite the haunting image, especially with his heart clean pierced through. Valentina takes a moment to realize that her charge is dead, before throwing herself at Gregor in a fit of rage. This scene is pretty much pitch perfect in execution and sends chills down my spine even on a rewatch. Moving back to our original team though, we're in quite the dismal situation. Alyssa is getting tortured, Faust is down for the count, Ishmael is barely hanging on, as is Sinclair. Hohenheim approaches Callisto to save his colleague. He isn't going to have another die on him, not like this. Thus, he converses on Callisto's level. It's a very out there conversation regarding his works, with some critiques and suggestions, but ultimately he offers himself in place of Alyssa. Having lowered Callisto's guard, however, he manages a surprise attack that buys barely enough time for Sinclair to manifest his signs. The power he had in his signs had been hinted at during spring cultivation, at least the ability to call upon it for strength. This time though, he imposes a future version of himself onto his body in an attempt to salvage the situation. Welcome to the stage, Abraxas Chariot Sinclair in all his glory, the second Smoke War veteran, the Green Damnation, and Deliverance. The most turbo prosthetic hater this side of the city. He is badass as all hell. But damn does he look like a Project Moon Edward Elric. The music here is godly, like what in the hell. However, thus far none of the tracks have missed, especially since all of them have gotten new additions to boot on top of the already fantastic tracks. Anyhow, while it's not much of a fight, this is the kind of payoff Vesper should have felt like. Vesper has nothing on Sinclair at this point. He even has green coins, a stupid amount of lore we'll cover later, and finally pays homage to all that he's learned leading up to this. There are callbacks to the Night Drifter and Shichun's finishing moves too. This was honestly my favourite moment in the Canto, which is kinda sad. As well, it's not about Sinclair now, is it? It's supposed to be about Roshu. That said, there's a lot to unpack here since he's not from a mirror, but a branch. Our boy has functionally done Terminator-style time travel though, since it's mentioned that this might be the end of the road for him here, that he existed for this very moment possibly, that the future in front of them may be the one to pass. It could be avoided with much hardship. He leaves some heavy words and implications for the team before heading off. All of that is enough for me to excuse this as not a real fight, since it's the kind of fan service I would rather have over the LCD we got in part 2. Next is the remains of LCD fanservice Boogaloo. There isn't much I want to praise here, it doesn't suddenly become a real fight either. There isn't much in the way of a cool, deductive way of ending the fight. However, we do get Matthias' weapon reveal. Levantine. Norse. Huh. Been a lot of those. We'll go into the various relics and weapons featured later, but suffice to say, not what I was expecting 100%. Being the fight between Gungnir and Levantine makes sense though. The more important thing we get paid off is how little Matthias cares for loyalty or family, or any of the middle's virtues. He's all about that grandstanding and full-on selfish determination. He willingly cuts his apprentice in half to get a blow on Vesper. If that had more of an impact, well, I'd be praising it more, but Vesper is still combat operational, and eventually slices clean through the man's head after Moses places a gaping hole through their chest. Flashy lights and fireworks, but overall a rather boring node, especially with how little falling action or resolution it gets later on. Plus, we can move onto a specific kind of tragedy. It's the only one that's time-stamped on my stream VOD actually. Welcome to the Roach Emperor fights. Gregor doesn't necessarily distort so much as unwraps part of his latent power, and it is abhorrently powerful. The blood shield that Virgilius offers to us may as well be paper once Gregor ramps up. This is another real fight. You can 100% lose it, and it could all come down to one turn if you are particularly unlucky or forget to redirect Virgilius' coins. Thankfully, the Red Gaze listens to the manager's orders, otherwise we'd be in for hell. That said, Gregor can absolutely fight toe-to-toe with him and even demolish him if we get particularly unlucky. We can see Virgilius' HP go concerningly low if the fight continues for too long. The ramifications of this fight are so strong that we can't even use Gregor from here on for the rest of the Canto. He doesn't even answer the summons of Dante later. That said, both Heathcliff and Roger are very adamant on bringing him back to his senses and show palpable relief in managing to do so. At that point, I reckon we're a little past the halfway mark now, as this part is around 5 to 7 hours depending on your reading speed and need to retry fights. Mind you, skipping is an option to later come back, but I stuck it out on each node for my EX clear instead. Next we get the inevitable what if for Rian murdering the sabotaged LCA agents. While this was hinted to in the Udjat Otis Uptai story, seeing it unfold is bloody brutal. That said, the man's fighting style is eerily similar, isn't it? Anyhow, this node does serve to showcase just how threatening a solo star of the city can be against even a geared up, albeit sabotaged, grade 1 office. The LCA may be getting hits by the Worf Effect or a Vegeta, but honestly that works in the narrative's favour, since we're only getting one round against him. The next node regards Saru and Roshu's purpose. In this particular case, rather than a monkey, Saru is a dog, used to control Roshu in order to make her do the nurse father's bidding. While the dog doesn't last all too long, it does have a profound impact on Roshu in seeing the levels to which her parents are willing to go. We get a proper glimpse into Roshu being raised, as well as how the nurse fathers treat her one by one again. It's one last remainder of things that come to pass before we get into the long haul of nodes 48 through 50. 9-48 is a real fight. Well, at least a non-spectacle fight. It requires you to field a tankier Roshu and play particularly well, or you will fail. It starts out as another rematch against the Pinky Nurse Father, albeit they have cast aside their dressings to reveal the woman underneath. By this point, if you haven't yet realized, Yomi has been Arya the entire time. The fight starts similar to the previous one, but escalates rather quickly, as when her HP falls to 0, or another sinner is killed, it will immediately transition to a second phase, the solo Roshu phase. Without some form of sustain or healing, Roshu is bound to die rather quickly. Plus, a tankier or more sustained heavy Roshu is recommended to take on this fight, because even if you win the clashes, Arya will chip away at her through fixed damage and unbreakable coins. Dayushu offers a poise barrier, while Red Eyes and Penitence offer some form of sustain through its healing. That said, while it isn't impossible to clear it with other Roshus, it is exceedingly difficult and potentially RNG reliant. That, or you'll need to be able to make use of her base ego every turn for fragile application, to race the damage clock down. Any /weak or /fatal Roshus are completely doomed here though. You could of course use a Roshu with evades, though that may be troublesome to set up depending on how lucky you get. Mage Shu may not be a bad option here in that regard, though her single target damage may be a bit lacking. Anyhow, we get the reveal after the fights, and the reasoning why Arya differs from Roshu. While the blood is the same, her control over time perception was not, causing her to age rapidly and eventually leave the safe on her own accord. This is where she is impressed upon by Rian and forged into the replacement Pinky Nurse Father. Ultimately though, Roshu cuts her down and tragedy begins. 9-49 is a trip. Roshu severs the ties with Dante as she can no longer get what she wants from the contract. She forcibly retires from Limbus company and begins fulfilling her original purpose. In using the Arayashiki, she's erasing memories and achieving an empty self. Mu is the concept of empty or nothingness in Japanese, whereas adding it to Muga, we get the Buddhist concept of soullessness. It's a rather fatalistic approach to life, but one in where it's easier to let go when the time comes. As someone growing up in a Buddhist household, this is taught rather early to brace you for future hardships of loss. But nonetheless, here we have a soulless Roshu, becoming an empty husk as she hacks away at everything in the nearby vicinity and erases it from existence. You can even see skills being erased away. While she's functionally a concept incinerator, perhaps there was something the Fingers wanted erased for good, as most concept incinerators only have a specific range tied to them. Considering Roshu's deleting people's entire existences here, well, surely there's something that must be destroyed no matter what then. Rian even comments on her potentially being the biggest topic at the next Finger Bow Bell later. Regardless, Sora and Ren throw themselves into the blender and die being erased from existence. Their deaths are quite pointless, but Dante of course still remembers them, as he does with Kafi and the events of Canto 4. Anyhow, this node is basically Roshu going full sicko mode with the blade, and is pretty much just a cutscene being played out in real time. There is zero risk of losing anyone here, so the pacing has absolutely no way of being interrupted this time. However, by the end of it, the blade is sealed almost as fast as it had come out. Arya, in clinging to life, resonates with Dante, who provides a solution to their problems. Though the chains that bind may have been severed, though the Roshu in front of him is nothing more than an empty husk, he believes that she can be brought back into the fold, forging a new chain through the use of Ira, Giburu's sapling of light resonance. There's an emotional gut punch where Arya plunges into the blender and reseals the Arayashiki once more, with new characters emblazoning the sheath. Roshu comes back to us, ready to stand side by side for the finale. The final battle this time is against an imitation of the Black Silence, the cruel fate to befall Rian. We call upon all of the sinners, except for Gregor, for this fight, and plunge into it. In mixing the Index and the Black Silence, we get a very unique fight that's pretty tough if you don't have a good mix of damage types and solid clashers. While I was able to solve it with an exceedingly janky team on my first go, I reckon a lot of fellows would struggle if they don't snowball fast enough, especially if Rian manages to stack any Grace of the Prescript or gain his unlock stages. Upon dealing enough damage, Roshu draws her blade one more time, erasing one last important memory, Arya in her entirety. Functionally, this is a reverse Heathcliff, wherein only he remembers Kathy. Instead, everyone else remembers Arya but Roshu. We get a little bit more of a payoff for Rian before ending the fights, then and there. While undermined by the emotional climax of the previous node, this one was still a fairly memorable affair too. As for the final node of the Canto, there is actually not much good I have to say about it. Rather, I wish there was at least 2 or 3 more nodes of story rather than whatever sitcom style wrap up we got here. We are granted very little in the way of falling action, and only a brief explanation of what may have happened in the final moments in regards to entanglement. Aside from that, the pass on is good, heartbreaking even if you look at the vocal credits. But then we get Roland's bad end followed by Endcorp setup, possibly for the next Intervalo or Canto. Now for the opposite end of the coin, the bad of Part 3. There's a lot that was rushed here. We've got pacing issues, gameplay issues, narrative inconsistencies, and a complete and total lack of falling action. The last one especially hurts because this is the one that needs it the most. In terms of pacing, this part is exceedingly long. Some of the fights drag on far longer than welcome, specifically the 2 middle fights. They aren't necessarily different fights mechanically either, since all you need to do is let the LCD handle Matthias while the LCB takes on Kira. It takes the worst parts of the Sora fight and extends it out over 2 nodes. If we had more impact in those fights, it'd feel better off, but otherwise, you can defeat Kira, then keep throwing out defensive skills to end the fight sooner. This is only exasperated by the grit section, wherein Matthias holds out for 3 straight turns at around 700 HP. While I get that you want to make him seem tough, a lot of players managed to kick down his HP fast enough that they were stuck there, confused, as to why they had to wait on Moses to charge up and finish the job. I feel like there was supposed to be a voice line or something once I reached that part, but as an English speaker I didn't quite catch it, and the subtitles just zoomed past instead. Maybe more of a technical error. When the fight transitioned to that particular section around round 2, I was confused as to why it wasn't ending. It almost feels like a cop-out that Vesper just shrugs off the injury to give Moses a second shot. Let the sinners do something dramatic there in that moment, you know? Vesper's injured after all. Let Yi-sang or Don jump in and try their best despite the odds. Moses could then plan around the exigent circumstances and launch a predictive shot and put a hole through the fella's chest. After that, let Ezra take the coup de grace. Instead, it's all Vesper in the end. I know it sounds like I'm just harping on the man at this point, but come on. Use the stuff you have access to for a more interesting narrative. Anyhow, the middle is probably the most at fault for the issues here. Kind of feels like they were forced in at the end, just to finish up all the fingers, really. And while they had no interactions with Roshu, either. You get a hand at Lucio, Ren, Sora, and even Albina, but never even meets Kira as far as I remember. What was the point of these guys? They don't really add to Roshu's narrative, and if anything, were the nicest almost, and pretty much actively detrimental to the forming of her as the perfect blade. Last though, I want to talk about pacing. This part is pretty much non-stop outside of the main team. It's a boss rush, and while that's by design, it gives little time for proper characterization. This time I believe Roger is the victim of having the least impact. Well, aside from how much she cares for Gregor anyhow, but Heathcliff also does the same here. Ishmael also gets next to nothing since it has to make room for Hohenheim, Alyssa, and Sinclair. Faust at least has something when it comes to the final node with the Discord call. If parts 1 and 2 were condensed into a single part or intervallo and part 3 was given that extra breathing room, I reckon we could have had a lot more to chew on. especially with all the big reveals here. Instead, we have to fast forward quite a lot of the apprentice's characterization. We barely even know Ren or Albina, and they're the first to appear. We know more about Sora, Kira, and Lucio at least, but honestly as characters they all feel quite wasted. There's a redeeming factor to them later on, but it's in a rather rough form that isn't an elegant solution at all. Plus, I also have to mention how quickly we get to the emotional climax, then resolve it. Roshu goes full sicko mode and tears Sora and Ren to shreds, but we only really cared about one of them. She doesn't do anywhere near substantial enough damage before Arya and Dante swoop in to save the day. If she had managed to erase more, or clearly shown to be completely despondent for a time, I reckon the impact would have been stronger. Not to mention, I know we have ampules in Dante's team. The whole purpose of them in the other teams is the fact that they can't rewind. The Dante's team shouldn't have that issue. If there were somehow any left, wouldn't they have saved Arya, or at least attempted to? Sure, the Arayashiki basically makes permanent cuts, but there's still some hope since it's the city after all. Cutting her down and not confirming that she's dead before going all out is a bit wild, you know? I get the emotional high and grief and all that, but still, feels like a little more could have been done for the travesty to really hit, you know? To add to this, the Rian fight comes right after and has to piggyback off of the previous emotional climax rather than forming his own. We kinda just feel like we're putting down an empty shell, a hollow imitation. Once again, that may as well be the idea, but at that point, we can just put away the Millie song, since it makes significantly less sense to make use of here. When I went back over my stream VOD, YouTube needed me to delete over 10 instances of the song, so it was starting to get a little on the fatiguing end. Not to say the song is bad on its own, it's a fantastic song, just that its repeated use doesn't help its case this time. Finally, I'm not a fan of the time entanglement shenanigans we had with Arya. Having a different perception of time being the crux of the matter feels like more of a cop-out. It's also kind of just a one-liner that Roshu apparently has a different grasp on time than others. They even claim that it's in her blood, which kinda just makes it worse. We're not really demonstrated this properly, aside from Roshu being stupid fast. In Time Killing Time, she does manage to outspeed the factory owner, but that's more so originally chalked up to her being deft in combat already. It's too small a hint to really use if I'm honest. Anyhow, story and pacing gripes aside, I need to talk about the gameplay here. It's almost all hype moments and aura. At best, there were only a few real fights, whereas the rest may as well be entirely scripted and shortened down. The LCB doesn't have a major enough impact, and in a few cases doesn't feel anywhere near threatened by the forces at hand. Once again, the middle fights are the worst in this regard, since once Kira is down, we're just watching the LCD style in Matthias twice. The full heal in that particular case is insulting. Every fight with the Pinky is quite good, with the caveat of having an invincible Roshu and designing around her being invincible is beyond stupid. There's no threat to the others if you can just eat the attacks. Thankfully, the Pinky fights do spread the damage around with their clash-related passives on the Lust attacks, though ironically, this actually isn't as much of an issue this time. As for the more egregious time this happens, it's 9-49. As to not mess with the pacing, Otis and Massault cannot actually die, even without the ampules. Roshu just needs to not die, and honestly, that may as well be impossible. You can just win rate through the entire node and watch the flashing lights. I wish the effects were a little more elegant than just a flash of strikes. Maybe painter's strokes or something would have been nice. I don't know. Go mimic her base ego more, since bright white slashes doesn't really do it for me at least. If we change to the bright white slashes after the resealing, I reckon that may have been more impactful. But I digress. That one is down to personal preference, I reckon. Admittedly, I also need to mention the second round with the ring too, since it pretty much hits the same situation with the middle. We pretty much have a colored fixer that can demolish the encounter. Regardless of our actions, the green deliverance and yellow harpoon fights are honestly some of the worst in terms of gameplay. Unfortunately, for the yellow harpoon though, we have to see him do this 3 times, compared to the green deliverance's 1 time. It also helps that Sinclair is a character a lot of people are invested in stark comparison to Vesper, who comes from a discontinued work. As for the fights with the Red Gaze, Valentina and Gregor are massively more threatening, to the point where contributing alongside Virgilius is actually important. Both of those are real fights, with real danger. Basically, I'd place this as having only 4 to 5 real fights, meaning the rest are either for show, or just extended cutscenes which pad out the runtime by quite a bit. Sitting down for 6 to 8 hours to clear this thing was a specific kind of hell I'd rather not repeat, and after a point, you're going to get tired of the flashing lights even if you are a moth. All of that said, I'm rather tired of picking out the bad stuff, so let's talk about the secret third category, the weird. You were expecting the ugly here, weren't you? Go watch The Good, the Bad, and the Weird. That movie is one hell of a trip. Anyhow, you know how I made a joke with the second video that this Canto is the Dark Souls of Cantos? Yeah, that aged a bit too well, because now rather than just a few fights having the equivalent of item descriptions for lore, it's all of them. Every single adversary in Part 3 has bloody flavor text in their skills, their passives, and for some of them, even their status effects. It's bloody maddening in some cases. So let me go over everything you may have missed if you didn't read the skills. Though I'll mostly be summarizing or paraphrasing rather than going word for word. There's some trickier ones to see since they only pop up during the fights, so for those, please do the fights yourself. Leaves you something to read as well. Hohenheim. He only gets a single line here, just the fact he wrote the Ego Gear Proficiency Manual. The rest of his kit is quite cool though. His Ego Attunement lets him fight toe-to-toe with a plus 15 offense level, making him functionally a level 60 with the gear on. Alyssa. She already knew her fate basically. Her defensive skill though, lets us know she intends on living. Callisto. Out of the Nurse Fathers, this fella has the least interesting flavor text to go over. The main conceit is that his magnum opus is his blade, Tibia, that of which uses his whole corpus and blood to create this masterstroke of a weapon. That aside is the mention of the robustness of ingredients that Callisto is after. He prefers ones with more musculature. Past there is the mention of the House of Spiders' reason for existence, alongside how little he cares for the golden bows. Of interest is his opinion on Rian, more specifically the god that Rian believes in. We know it to be Hermes, but Callisto ruminates on whether or not being tied to a god is something of a curse or blessing. Not much else here. Albina. Much like her master, Albina has turned her body into a weapon. Tassia is the body, whereas Albina is the mind. The artistic approach is simply the question of what makes the person between the two. Aside from that is her approach to securing ingredients for corpus works. A certain Sinclair. Of the Abraxas chariots, the Green Deliverance or Damnation has a lot to break down. Well, a lot to take in, rather. First off is the mention of the Second Smoke War, waged between humans and those who no longer look the part. The passive sheds light on the difference, increasing damage against distortions and mechanical amalgams. Truly the #1 prosthetic hater. We're given further insights into the smoke, wherein it was much the same as the first in many ways. This time around though, guerrilla warfare over trench warfare played a larger role. Airborne forces also seemingly play a major part, those that would swoop in utilizing singularities before disappearing. Of the fearsome groups out there is notably this Sinclair's organization, the Abraxas Chariot, alongside the Descenders of 101 Doors and the Dimension Roamers. Next is the description of the fella's weapons. They're not anything special, but, in tandem with his coats, gave rise to a nickname, the Green Damnation or Green Deliverance. Essentially, he has a color title, but not in an official capacity. Valencina. There's a lot to unpack here with her descriptions, not as much as Sinclair so to speak, but we get a view into relics and the Palametan style. First off, the Eye of Odin is but 1/3 of a set of a whole relic, broken into 3 parts. We're not necessarily told what the other 2 parts are here, but we do get what this part does. It's essentially a super prediction computer that provides the most likely scenario in the upcoming instant. This synergizes a lot with the Palametan style, since it's known to accelerate the longer a duel lasts, meaning the future scene can be the future had significantly faster as the fight progresses. Plus, the more we clash, the hotter my sword will become, and accelerate to bring us to the future I saw. Pretty cool synergy to find. We also find out that it isn't perfect, and that as it heats up, problems ensue. Next we get the moment of dismissal from her family. While it's hinted that it's due to her behavior, we don't get the exact act that caused it. That said, they let her keep the relic and her blade, spitting her rapid rise in her face. Under the Shin passive speaks of Rian's offer to get Roshu back, her ticket. He's hesitant but is willing. Finally, is one more on the Palametan style. Essentially, it's a flashy and fancy dueling style that focuses on one target at a time that accelerates over time. It's not an assassination style, but one placed proudly on public display. Aside from that, it goes on about Valencina being a war hero, one whose fall was unimaginable. Lucio. For the farm apprentice, we get a rather sad story regarding a man made into a textbook. First is the mention of his skills elevating in meeting a colored fixer in battle, if he survives, that is. At this point, we know he really doesn't. As for the other block of text, we get a peek into his thoughts in the past and in the moment. Although he could so easily kill his master in her sleep, he refuses to action it, whether out of gratitude or experience. Yet the resentment he held for her ran exceedingly deep, so he swears to himself that once this battle is over, he will kill her in pretty brutal fashion. This is what gives him the determination to fight this time around. While this makes him a walking contradiction in his loyalty to Valentina, it shows how troubled a life he had even after being picked up. Ren. Like most of the other apprentices, he doesn't have much. His is very tranquil in mentioning even if the dream was fleeting, and though he may fail to inherit the name of a star in this life, he still finds walking the way of the blade to temper his blade. This is a little Buddhist feeling, but otherwise, a whole lot of nothing for him. Arya. Most of Arya's passives regard Ryoshu and her impression towards her. There's also a mention of some timey-wimey entanglement shenanigans within too. A lot of them are quite sad or otherwise resentful, with a hint of regrets. Last for Arya I must mention is Ketsuen. While more so a part of Ryoshu at this point, this is Arya's ego in the form of Ryoshu's sheath. It is specifically created to control the Aryashiki, forged in the eternal flame. In this regard, Ryoshu's base ego image is now her hugging Arya, I guess. Matthias. For the Great Brother, we get his background as well as details on the blade he is using. Rather, we get both in tandem. Once a loyal Great Brother, now disgraced overtaking the sword Levantine for himself. He killed the others that pined for it, and more or less deceived the rest of the syndicate, though a good chunk could hazard a guess as to what he had done. In doing so, he was ostracized, but at least he has the blade. Surprisingly, he has the aptitude for it too. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to wield it. Aside from that, there's the usual middle rhetoric of annihilation and overwhelming power, as well as a call to Shin. More specifically, that he doesn't need any fancy tricks or that Shin crap, and will just brute force his way through with his augments. Overall, he's not a particularly complicated character, just a selfish idiot. You know. Hers are brief, but do give us a glimpse into her mentality. He's an outcast among the middle members, as well, but wishes for that sibling-style relationship they so flaunt. Aside from that is mention of her instincts and experience. Like most of the apprentices, not much here. Ezra. Hers is callback to the Distortion Detective, especially with the S3 with the Yuria axe. The special handmade Golden Retriever exclusive axe, it says. Past there makes mention of the Alice workshop backpack she's holding onto. Not too much to chew on here, honestly. Vespa. There's some Ezra in here, excitedly talking about giving the fellow their colored fixer title, as well as some mention of Gungnir. I've had some people scream that this should be the yellow spear or yellow javelin, but that's neither here nor there. As for the relic, like with the rest of the relics, they seem to choose their owners, meaning you have to possess the aptitude to wield them. Vespa has the ability to wield Gungnir, as Matthias has the ability for Levantine. Aside from that, Vespa has some generic one-liners attached to his skill freeze. Moses. There's not too much here. It's mostly talking about the red points that she is concentrating, and bits and pieces hinting at the smoke war. There's not much aside. The Roach Emperor. All of Gregor's ones are very eerie or unnerving. There's the question on the wrappings. We already know there are more now, but when going through this node for the first time, it's horrifying. We're given the reality of roaches to boot. Stubborn, baleful, tenacious, and unmatched by those scorned as pests. Aside from that, we get a few creepy one-liners, but that about sums up the Roach Emperor. The Red Gaze. Virgilius doesn't have much to say about himself. He follows the flow. Aside from that, Blinding Blood does have some flavor. It's the idea that blood can be used as a weapon, but it can also be used for a cheap trick. He seems a little indignant saying it, but otherwise it is funny since yes, blood in your eyes is a concern in combat. Sora. Doesn't have all too much here. There's a few lines in her passive, but they're looking for affirmation from either Rian or the prescript. Desire for acknowledgements is probably the sadder of the two. Once I'm back home, Mr. Rian will tell me I did good. Muga Ryoshu. We get her entire thought process in regards to leaving the House of Spiders and saving Arya from living a life like her own. I recommend reading this one for yourself in full rather than having me paraphrase it. As for the new piece of information here, it regards the Tiansha star, essentially reading as being the star of oblivion, inspiring neither heaven, earth, man, and the self. The star only rises for one who perceives all existence and time as a single whole, and to sever them all. Part of me more or less imagines this as a god-slaying blade at that point, but we're getting ahead of ourselves there, I reckon. Rian. The Index Nurse Father, we get more background into him, rather the raising and subsequent killing of his family. It's just Roland again. Aside from that, we get some references to Roland in Argalia, as well as the rundown on his weapon, specifically the forms it can take and the link to the prescripts. Past there is a not-so-subtle mention of Hermes, who seemingly delivers prescripts to him. The god of the city is just outright named here at that point. Passive flavor out of the way, next is the relics and weapons used in this canto. There's a lot of them, and very few of them are actually Japanese. It's pretty much just the Ariashiki, that is. Gungnir, the Spear of Odin, known to never miss. At least that's the most popular attribution. Here it's Vesper's weapon and treated a little more like an Eldar singing spear. Levantine, a small arm crafted by Loki. The most outstanding property of this thing is the non-agreeance of what form this thing is supposed to take. Sword, dart, dagger, wand even. In the case of Matthias, they play with the idea that it's a massive hunk of steel before showing off its true form as a very small sword for a very big guy. Pretty fitting for a weapon made by a trickster god. The Eyes of Odin. These ones are a little strange to reference, but in being but a third of the sets, it makes a little more sense. Odin doesn't necessarily have precognition, but is more so vast predictive wisdom as is mostly reckoned. A site-based supercomputer being part of the prediction engine does make sense for Belencina's relic. I reckon the rest of the relics cover either his wisdom or some kind of road of sacrifice. This is the relic I reckon we'll see more of in the future. Arayashiki. This one is complicated. It's not something typically learned in Buddhism since they prefer to be a lot more vague on how the afterlife and reincarnation cycle works. But in this case, it's a little more explicit. Essentially, it's a storehouse for karma and staging ground for reincarnation. It's rather strange in this particular case to have a sword named after it, but I digress. Perhaps the blade was named after what it's supposed to sever, rather than what it's supposed to embody. Next is the literary references. In this canto, some of them are played really straight, whereas others are really weird in their implementation. There's plenty of Buddhist titles and concepts that are mixed into node names and whatnot, but coming from a former practitioner, they're all pretty much used in the wrong place or context. Shurajo and Abi-kyokan are probably the most annoying, but nonetheless make some kind of sense. Akutagawa is guilty of this too, of course, since their more Buddhist-leaning works are also just wrong feeling, but to copy that one for one is pretty funny. As for the feelings of dread and unease in Akutagawa's works being bought over, no, that checks out. Good job on that front, Kim Ji-hoon. The Hellscreen stuff though, the use of Saru as the dog is quite weak. Now Ren as the Saru makes a whole heck of a lot more sense, since he plunges into the metaphorical flame with Araya. Ryoshu in this case is less so the artist and more so the flames, which is kinda funky. But aside from that, they do embody a lot of Yoshihide's softer qualities. As for the stranger tendencies, those are more so harbored by the rest of the syndicate members. Physical abuse of apprentices, Balencina. Verbal abuse of apprentices, Shiomi. Material indulgence for their daughter, Matthias. Artistry no matter the cost, Callisto. And of course, beholden to a higher power of sorts, rather his compulsion to a godlike figure, Rian. Though rather than a Lord Horikawa requesting the Hellscreen to Yoshihide, it's more so Hermes requesting to Rian through the prescripts. All in all, it's a rather unique way of adapting Hellscreen's concepts while playing around with Akutagawa's more prevalent themes within his work. Maybe someday I'll release a more detailed breakdown on that front, but today is not that day. Finally, a personal indulgence of sorts. Part of Akutagawa's work since day one. The Rashoumon Effect. Did you trust the Eco that was impossibly pissed? Blinded by rage and obsession with specific details? The one that was too stubborn about their vision of good writing to budge and turned everything up to 11 to prove a point? The one who put on such a convincing performance for you, since they must have been convinced that nothing short of hyperbole would get through to the fandom? Or did you believe in the apologetic one? The one that moved to do damage control, in possibly having regrets in their performance, filing down the claws and sharp edges, treating you with kitty gloves and only expositing on the good that the Canto had to offer. Else perhaps you were waiting for this very video, surely the one that would have nuance and relay the truth of the matter, holding up the community zeitgeist, having to give a long disclaimer and apology before every point made, for critiquing Project Moonworks is but an exercise in futility. In the end, everything should be a lukewarm take within the realm of reason, right? Well, go on. Which eco do you believe in? All three of them are something I have to offer after all. That much can be demonstrated through the past two videos and consequently this one. However, I must preface, you've been played since the start. While I wasn't a fan of Octagoa by any stretch of the imagination, I did come to resonate with his works in some way or another, specifically with this little concept called the Rashoumon Effect. It's ever present in his work, wherein there are fools and unreliable narrators to an almost unhealthy degree, the biased accounts that leave the storytelling open to interpretation and keep you thinking long after you've finished the piece. So perhaps I've decided to go a little meta, go beyond the average critic's obligations in providing an objective review, and instead provide multiple different accounts of a single product, in this case Canto 9, the Canto that would cover the man's works. For the short story of Hellscreen isn't anywhere substantive enough to do the heavy lifting alone. Why not try a little experiment to see if anyone would catch on? Why not put the Rashoumon Effect into practice myself to get a better understanding of the man's writing? Thus we arrived at the method. Read the source material for inspiration. There's several works one should account for with Octagoa, especially with what's been said regarding Roshu. The short list comes down to Rashoumon, Yamgruel, Fortune, The Spider's Thread, Inner Grove, and of course Hellscreen. All of these have their eventual relevance for this act down the line, but are nonetheless the inspiration for this critique in the end. Next is to play the content, of course. Note down the stuff I really liked and anything I didn't, even if it was something that could be brushed off or justified. Write it down even if it's a 1 in level of grievance or just an edge case positive. In the case of parts 1 and 2, there were many minor nitpicks, but nothing that was too glaring or egregious. As for positives, I could say the same, there wasn't all too much to bite on there. Part 3 was a whole other can of worms that needed addressing, thus ended up in this video instead. Next to lay the trap. Take the grievances, no matter how small, and dial them up to 11. An ambush? No, that's a Diablos Ex Machina. Vesper? Must be a Deus Ex. Oh, not to mention the mannequins. Turn the rage past what is healthy. Take your old acting chops from the theater, the writing of your tabloid days, lies, deceits, whatever tools you have available to you. Lay the best trap you can for this community you're a part of, because in being part of it, you already know how to push their buttons. Once deployed, let it stew for a while. Let people think that you're being genuine and not just trying to write a Plinkett review. That would be far too obvious. Then provide the next account of matters. Be blindingly positive about things. Radiant in your stance. Sure, there's only so much you can hype up, but make the best of what's there and let people believe it's the truth as well. To add a layer of credibility, apologize for the last one too. Call it out for being rage baits. Say that it was only meant for a few people's eyes and not such an explosive response. Finally, once all is said and done, release the final account. Level the nuances, relay the deduction in full. Give them the narrative you think they want. You've got so much data now to work with after all. People being unfettered and unfiltered, responding to the bait. Fellas joining in on the praise with the fold. You know what the people want, even if it costs you your credibility. I won't lie, that part stung a bit, but nothing I'm not used to. At a whim back in the day, I had to write articles covering celebrity news. There was one that saw my article and tore into it hard. They contacted the outlet, wanted a piece that gassed them up instead, with the specification of needing to be under the same author's name. They wanted whatever writer had done up the hit piece to admit all their wrongdoings and start glazing them instead. Myself behind the veil with the pen name was mortified, but at the end of the day, it wasn't me that was going to lose credibility. It was this flimsy identity interposed onto the writing staff. We could come up with a new one if no one trusted this one anymore. I don't have that kind of luxury anymore, so I knew the risk I was taking on. That said, I still went through with it because I thought there was some lesson to be taught here. A rather valuable one at that. Call it self-satisfaction, narcissism, or disingenuity. Whatever label you may want to place on it, go ahead. But I'm someone who learns from mistakes, and thus I forced the audience of those videos to make one too, in convincing them that either account was genuine. Creating the trappings of rage baits and the subsequent apologist narrative is probably the best masterstroke I could have made in teaching about the Rashoumon Effect. The only thing is, this final review becomes increasingly hard to write, since even if I'm genuine with my thoughts this time, can you actually trust me with critique anymore? Well, that's the thing. I don't want people to trust me 100% of the time. I'd rather you come to your own conclusion after hearing what I have to say. I'm here to push you a specific direction, be a stopgap, but not be the be-all and end-all. If you agree with something I have to say, then so be it, but please, never treat my word as law. That's the last thing I would want to hear. I'm not a fan of having my opinions repeated by others and treated like fact. Being a talking head means I'm here to entertain, not to tell you how to think. But I'm not a news outlet. My word isn't unbiased or the law, not by any stretch. All of that is the essence of the Rashoumon Effect, differing biased accounts that make you question what was the reality, make you think and come up with your own conclusions. In Akutagawa's works, there are several realities within. Many of them are quite open-ended, leave you pondering for a while. At first I was particularly pissed at this way of writing, his having cake and eating it, but over time I grew more attached to the ambivalence within. That's the unique takeaway I want you guys to have after listening to these Canto 9 reviews. There's a certain beauty in the ambivalence that I would like for you guys to appreciate too. When the time comes for me to step over other cantos, I hope I can bring the author's works and contributions to you as well. However, this one will likely remain the most divisive by far. Thanks for all the support these past few weeks. Whether you were buying wolf tickets to my downfall with the bait or already caught onto the pretense, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll likely get back to more normal content following this one, so please subscribe if you'd like to see ID reviews, team strategies, and other PM-related jank. If for some reason I ever get around to that Canto 6 review, you're going to be hearing about the romantics and the sublime, and well, I've got far too much to say about those. Anyhow, if you've gotten to the end of the video, let me know in the comments which one of the three you thought was the most real review, whether it be the rage bait, the apologetic glaze, or this final one here. Thank you for tuning in.